On the morning of December 2nd, 1805, a thick layer of fog covered the rolling hills near the small town of Austerlitz in Moravia. Through the mist, tens of thousands of soldiers waited in tense silence. Muskets rested on their shoulders. Cannons stood ready along the frozen fields. Officers bent over their maps, trying to understand exactly what Napoleon Bonaparte was planning. Because the position of the French army seemed wrong. The combined Russian and Austrian forces, nearly 90,000 strong, faced Napoleon's army of only around 70,000. On paper, the Allies held the advantage. They had more soldiers, more cavalry, and the backing of two of the most powerful empires in Europe. And yet, Napoleon had chosen this battlefield very carefully. In fact, he had chosen it weeks in advance. He studied every hill, every road, every village, and then he did something no one expected. He abandoned a strong defensive position and moved his army into a formation that looked weak, dangerously weak. His right flank appeared exposed, too exposed. From the Allied perspective, the opportunity seemed obvious. If they struck hard at that flank, they could shatter the French line, cut Napoleon off from Vienna, and possibly destroy his army entirely. The Allied commanders believed they had discovered Napoleon's mistake. They were wrong. In reality, Napoleon had made no mistake. He was setting a trap. And if the Allies followed the plan they had spent the entire night preparing, they would walk straight into it. Napoleon himself stood calmly near the village of Austerlitz, watching the fog slowly spread across the battlefield. One of his marshals asked him whether they should reinforce the right flank before the enemy attack began. Napoleon shook his head. Let them think they are winning. It was a remarkably confident statement, considering 90,000 enemy troops were marching toward what appeared to be his weakest point. But Napoleon had calculated something critical. The key to the entire battlefield was not his right flank. It was a hill at the center, the Pratzen Heights. Whoever controlled those heights would control the battlefield, and Napoleon intended to take them at exactly the right moment. But to understand how such a trap could even exist, we need to step back and see how Europe was led to this battle. When Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France in 1804, the rest of Europe did not send congratulations. Their reaction was closer to collective panic. From the perspective of Europe's monarchies, Napoleon represented something deeply dangerous. He was not just a ruler. He was the product of a revolution that had executed a king and abolished aristocratic privilege. To them, Napoleon was proof that the old order could be overthrown. And worse, he seemed extremely good at winning wars. Britain had been fighting France for years, but mostly at sea. However, the emergence of Emperor Napoleon changed everything. If he secured control over continental Europe, Britain could be completely isolated. And so, they did what they had mastered: funding war. Instead of fighting alone, Britain used its financial power to build alliances. Money flowed to Austria. Money flowed to Russia. In return came massive armies. And from this, the Third Coalition was born. On paper, it was overwhelming. But Napoleon understood something his enemies did not. Coalitions often appear stronger than they actually are, because one side has unified command, while the other has multiple generals, multiple governments, and multiple opinions. This creates complex plans, sometimes brilliant, but sometimes extremely dangerous. And Napoleon was ready to exploit that. In 1805, Europe was preparing for victory, and Napoleon was preparing for a hunt. Part 2. The Pinnacle of War. From Austerlitz to Tilsit, 1805 to 1807. In 1805, Europe was preparing for victory. Napoleon was preparing a hunt. Not a hunt for armies, but a hunt for the very structure of his enemy's warfare. And from that moment, the old rules began to collapse. To understand how he did it, we must begin with the machine behind it, a new war machine, victory before the first shot. The Grande Armée was not just a larger army, it was an entirely different system. Instead of moving as a single mass, Napoleon divided it into independent corps, each with infantry, cavalry, and artillery to fight on its own, and that created two devastating advantages. First, speed. French forces no longer clogged a single road. They moved across multiple axes, faster than any opponent. Second, concentration of force at the decisive point. Napoleon didn't need to be stronger everywhere. He only needed to be stronger at the right place, at the right time. This was the essence of modern warfare, not who is stronger, but who arrives first, where it matters. The first campaign using this system shattered the enemy before they even understood what was happening. A surrender without a battle. Austrian General Mack made a classic mistake. He read the map using old logic. He expected Napoleon to come from the west. Napoleon did the opposite. The Grande Armée crossed the Rhine, pivoted south, then swept north of Ulm, cutting off Vienna. This was not a frontal attack. This was severing the enemy's nervous system. Mack waited for a battle. Napoleon made sure it never came. The core of Ulm. Not destroying the enemy with firepower, but with strategic disorientation. By the time Mack realized he was surrounded, it was too late. 30,000 men surrendered. There is no Austerlitz without Ulm, because Ulm proved Napoleon could win without fighting. But Ulm was only the opening. The masterpiece awaited at Austerlitz. Austerlitz, the art of making the enemy destroy themselves. Austerlitz was not a battle, it was a script. Napoleon did not defeat the Allies, he made them break themselves. Step 1. The illusion of weakness. He deliberately abandoned the Pratzen Heights, weakened his right flank, acted as if he were retreating. The goal, to make the enemy believe this was their chance to destroy him. And they believed it. Step 2. Pulling the enemy out of position. The Allied plan crushed the French right, but in doing so, they emptied their center. Napoleon did not attack strength, he waited for emptiness. Step 3. A single sharp blow. As the fog lifted, Soult advanced, not a broad assault, but a concentrated strike at the center. Do not disperse power, focus it on one point. The Pratzen Heights fell, the Allied army split in two, and from that moment, it was no longer a battle, it was a pursuit. Step 4. Fix and destroy. To the south, Davout held a much larger force. He didn't need to win, he only needed to hold them. When the center collapsed, Napoleon turned and struck downward. The Allies were trapped. That was the moment victory was decided. Austerlitz was a complete lesson. Force the enemy to move wrong, concentrate at weakness, and attack structure, not men. And if Austerlitz was art, the next campaign was the destruction of an entire system. Speed versus tradition. Prussia fought like the 18th century. Napoleon fought like the future. At Jena, he overwhelmed with speed, but the decisive battle happened elsewhere. At Austerlitz, Davout faced double his numbers. He didn't retreat, he reshaped the battlefield. Villages to break formations, tight lines against cavalry, counterattack at the right moment. He didn't rush victory, he stretched time until the enemy collapsed. When the Prussian command broke, their entire system followed. This was not just victory, it was flexibility defeating rigidity. But even this system had limits. Eylau, the limit of genius. Eylau was chaos, snow, lost units, Russian artillery dominance. For the first time, Napoleon lost control. His solution? Not precision, but force. Murat's cavalry charged the center, not to win, but to buy time. Eylau revealed something dangerous. When the system fails, even Napoleon needs luck. But genius is defined by what comes next. Friedland, the perfect finish. At Friedland, Napoleon found what he needed, a mistake. The Russians stood against a river, limited retreat. Napoleon did what he always did best, focus everything on one point. Grand Battery Senarmol advanced artillery forward, closer, closer. At that range, grape shot turned artillery into machine guns. Artillery was no longer support, it was decisive. The Russian center broke, the river became a trap. And after all the battles, Napoleon ended the war with something stronger than force. Tilsit, war ends with psychology. After Friedland, he didn't need to fight, he needed to convince. On a raft, he spoke not as a conqueror, but as an equal. The final strategy, not destroy Russia, but turn it into a temporary ally. And in a moment, Europe was divided. By the end of 1807, Napoleon had done what no one thought possible. He had defeated Austria, shattered Prussia, and forced Russia to negotiate. For the first time in centuries, one man stood at the center of Europe, not just as a general, but as the one who decided how war itself was fought. His system was perfect: speed, precision, control. And as long as the battlefield followed his rules, he could not be beaten.
But that was the problem. Because not every war follows the rules. Eylau had already shown it. Chaos, weather, distance, things no strategy could fully control. And somewhere beyond the borders of his empire, a power still remained. Not defeated, not controlled, only temporarily aligned. Russia. And the next war would not be a battle. It would be something far more dangerous. A war against distance, against winter, against reality itself. And for the first time, Napoleon would step into a campaign he could not control. The French invasion of Russia, 1812.